Welcoming everybody to L2con for today's panel, Advancements and Performance Issues in Layer 2 Solutions. We'll start off with some brief introductions and then we'll jump right in. Feel free to come and sit in if you like. We'll start here with Zac and then go down the line.
Hello everyone, I'm Zac. I am the CEO and co-founder of Aztec. We are a privacy-focused Layer 2 for Ethereum.
Hello, is this working? Okay. Hello, okay, now it's working. Hello, I'm Mustafa. I'm the co-founder of Celestia and CEO of Celestia Labs. Celestia is a scalable data availability layer for roll-ups across any ecosystem.
All right. Hey there, my name is Kalodner. I'm co-founder and CTO at Offchain Labs, core developers of Arbitrum.
Hello, I'm Jordi Baylina. I'm the technical lead at Polygon CKVM and one of the co-founders of Polygon.
Awesome. Well, welcome in everybody. Great to have you. I think to kind of lay the groundwork for the beginning of this panel, throughout the last 6 months and really even in the second half of 2023, we saw the rise of launching more and more rollups. A lot of RAS providers came online and there's been app chains, general purpose rollups launching, and to kind of set the framework, why are we seeing all of these new rollups launch, and kind of what is the core reasoning for builders launching their own chains and kind of owning their execution environment?
Yeah, so I think there's several reasons for it, but as you said, like a few years ago, most of the rollups were kind of general universal rollups, like just deploy a smart contract there, you know, like OP mainnet, Arbitrum 1, you know, those kinds of rollups. But over the past year or so, we've seen an explosion in specifically application-specific rollups, where like developers are choosing, instead of deploying a new smart contract on a specific chain, they're choosing to deploy a whole new rollup just for the application. And there's several reasons for that, but it kind of boils down to something called the fat application thesis, which basically says like the base layer should be minimal, but applications will try to consume more and more of the stack. And that makes sense for several reasons. First of all, the applications can kind of capture more value, whether it's through like their own capturing MEV directly or capturing kind of like transaction fees directly instead of leaking all that value to the base layer. That's one reason. And then and another reason is there's a lot of things or use cases that rollups want to do that just aren't possible by if you're forced to share the computational resources of a Layer 1 or Layer 2 where other applications are running. So for example, you've got applications like Orderly, which is like a DEX that uses a very high amount of gas per transaction, and that simply wouldn't be fair to run on a shared smart contract platform because that's taking away a lot of computational resources from other applications. And we've also seen lots of experiments in, for example, gaming, where Curio, for example, have managed to embed a real-time strategy game in the EVM, and that's only possible because they're able to launch as a rollup that can, because they want to fork the EVM to add a game engine as an opcode to their rollup. So I think the two reasons why is the economics of it, and then simply more use cases are possible.
I would say there is many reasons, but the first one probably is the sovereignty of the chains. I mean, the chain wants to be somehow sovereign. I mean, they don't want to depend on the underneath layers somehow. So having a rollup gives you this sovereignty. Also because the needs of each chain differs very much. I mean, some chains may want a centralized sequencer, maybe others want a decentralized sequencer. Maybe some of them, they want a specific token, others want another kind of token. Even, maybe they want some state transition function. Maybe you want some chain that's EVM chain, but maybe there are other chains that are not even EVM. I mean, they are more specialized or whatever chain on that. Or maybe in terms of data availability, I mean, maybe there are chains that they want data availability to be in Ethereum in Layer 1, but maybe other chains they want to be in some cluster consensus or maybe in another chain. And then there is also, so this is our different things, but there is also, I would say, a third motivation, and is I would say the business model that each app chain is behind that. The fact that you have your own chain, that you have your own sequencer, that you have your own rollup somehow, this opens the door to new to new monetization ways. So this opens the door to collect maybe the fees of your chain, collect for different specific transactions, maybe give some incentives to some specific transactions in your chain. So this gives you a lot of flexibility, and I think that the world, the blockchain world that we are going to, is going to be many chains. And the big question here is the friction of moving funds and interacting between these chains. And this is where the ACK layer in Polygon, this is where we are working hard. Here we believe in a world with many chains connected together, but that they act very much as a single chain, so that you have this composability between chains on that. This is the vision that we are seeing in the future, and this happens for many rollups.
Yeah, and so both what you and Mustafa are saying are both, it's around sovereignty, customizability, and also application specific, which I think that there's been a shift in the way that people are thinking about rollups, in that it was kind of an ecosystem of apps, a DeFi ecosystem, there was a NFT marketplace, etc. And I think now people are starting to think about it more as microservices, as specific use cases. Zach, did you have something to add there?
Yeah, I think it's partially how things are developing. For base layers or general purpose layers, so layer 1s, layers 2s, you have this friction where the layer 2 needs and the layer 1s need certain security properties. You need permissionlessness, you need strong censorship resistance, you need data availability, and there are a large class of applications that don't need one or several of the properties that the network there requires. So, for example, if you're doing microtransactions, your users trust you. The transactions are 10 cents. Do you really need to pay for extreme censorship resistance and finality times? No, not really. And so that generality creates friction because it prevents high-quality abstraction layers being produced for application-specific needs. And I think this is a large part of the reason that's driving application-specific rollups, and that's only going to increase over time. I'm gonna talk about the elephant in the room though, which is that there is an explosion of rollups because we're seeing a lot of diversification in the space, and people can clearly see the value that's being proposed for them. But they were also last cycle's kind of narrative meme, and so a lot of companies that raised from the last cycle are now deploying, and there are many chains that have, I would say, they don't really differentiate themselves in terms of the value proposition, or perhaps maybe they shouldn't have been a rollup at all. And those chains will die. We'll see that as the ecosystem becomes more mature.
Is that happening at the execution layer? Is it happening at the data availability layer? Is it like a niche community thing? How are you looking at how are chains going to be differentiated?
I mean, it's all about the user, and by the user I mean the people deploying to these networks. What do they need? We can talk about the kind of the technical terms, data availability or permissionlessness, but ultimately it's like people have applications they're building and they're feeling hamstrung by certain properties of blockchains that they don't need. They may want the composability aspect of it, but they don't want to pay the kind of transaction costs you have to pay on Ethereum because you have this kind of immutable data store that's never going away. If you're selling, if you're selling like small value transactions, that doesn't make any sense. And so that's the kind of diversification. I feel like it's almost a sign of the space is quite primitive in terms of its tooling, where you have applications that are deciding we're going to launch our own rollup, and a lot of them are kind of building a lot of the technology stack kind of from scratch. I would see that almost as like an act of almost like desperation, because they lack off-the-shelf technologies and tools to actually focus on delivering the value and the service that they want to build. We're starting to see that being remedied with things like OPStack, but I still think it's very early days.
It's funny, from my perspective, I would say we're like heavily into this sort of like commoditization of the technology kind of at this point, and that like, I mean, I agree with kind of by and large everything that everybody said, so this is not a very good question for driving disagreement among the panel. It's an interesting one though. I mean, I would say, yeah, I mean, it's, and kind of just extending the point before, like, creation of some sort of community seems like kind of the driving force of like, if whatever the given thing is, the given chain is makes traction, in that kind of, you don't need to have every chain kind of technically differentiated necessarily. Like, it could be differentiated in different ways. The kind of core thing that they're providing is a kind of bubble of synchronous composability between the applications that are deployed on that chain. And so you can certainly have like a gaming chain that doesn't really look at the technical level any different than a DeFi chain, but attracts sort of a much different user base. And sort of one of the things that's going to be interesting to see in terms of like long-term adoption of these chains and like what will succeed and what will not, since there will presumably over time be kind of a shakeout and consolidation to some degree, not down to kind of a tiny number of chains, but like the likelihood is certainly that some chains will struggle to kind of create that narrative and that ecosystem that's relatively kind of difficult to create.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I wasn't talking about technical differentiation I was talking about value proposition. Like, if you're making a gaming chain where you have a community focused around gaming, and you have a network of gamers that you've brought to your platform and consolidated, like that's a unique value proposition. Even if your technology stack is, pretty doesn't have anything new or unique to it.
So we fully agree.
Yeah.
Kenny, I want to get you involved here. We've been discussing kind of the differences between the app-specific model and kind of some of the general purpose model, as well as this expansion of new chains leading to kind of more fragmentation in the space, but also just more optionality for builders and for users to kind of park their funds. From your perspective, what is the more important factor in kind of this sovereignty versus interoperability question? Like, what is more important to you as a builder, or kind of how are you thinking about this debate of optimizing for like a sovereign execution environment, but also trying to optimize for interoperability to access the network effects of other ecosystems?
Yeah, first, sorry for being late. It's my first time in Brussels. I'm sure it's yours as well. Unexpected traffic. But yeah, so I'm Kenny. I'm one of the founders of Manta Network. And so it's a really good question because, we're kind of in the thick of it, right? Amongst the other L2s here as well. And I think there's some really good points that have been brought up so far. And just to kind of think about that, right? Like, I think, Harry brought up a good point about the technical differentiation and whether or not it truly really matters versus other sort of factors right now, especially with relation to community. And I think it is very true because it's almost like trying to sell you different bottles of water and telling you where these bottles of water originate from, where, maybe 2-3% of the population that's buying water care that it comes from a glacier, but the other 97% just want to be hydrated. And we see that a lot in the ecosystem building as well, right? This is why a lot of applications go and look for grants through across 5-6 different ecosystems, because at the end of the day, regardless of the differentiation, the apps can build their community, can build their products, can thrive on one or many different chains. And I think that speaks volumes to the future of sovereignty versus interoperability, right? I think that one of the biggest frictions right now is, there is a proliferation of the L2s and innovation on the infrastructure angle from there, but not enough of innovation on that interoperability side. And I think if you take an examination to other industries, such as cloud computing, right, the question is, why don't cloud computing servers run general purpose servers, right? Why doesn't one cloud computing server run 50 different applications and serve you Duolingo and Instagram and TikTok and all these other things, right? The reason why each of these cloud computing servers serves you one instantiation of one specific application is because that's what's optimized to scale. And so I think that in the short term, yes, right, like sovereignty is very important, and it gives applications an opportunity to have these sandbox environments where they can build, scale, grow without having to worry about all the DevOps side that infrastructure comes with. But in the long term, right, in order to really achieve that massive scale, then I don't think that having purely general purpose VMs are, or not VMs, but just infrastructure L2s in general are going to be sufficient enough to match up with that scale. And inevitably, we're going to see kind of a similar model in the cloud computing space play out in Web3, which is, I think, the most optimal way.
Yeah, I mean, I also used to think for a long time that there was this inherent trade-off between like scalability and interoperability, or even sovereignty and interoperability. But now I kind of less think so, because I think like the bridging space has grown so much. Like there's so many the state of the art of bridging has evolved so much that like there are solutions out there where you can have multiple chains, and you're on one chain, and you can interact with a different chain. And from a user experience perspective, they can't tell it's a different chain. So, for example, like on Cosmos, so a user on the Cosmos hub can mint an NFT on an NFT chain with one transaction without having to bridge first. So, things like chain abstraction, intents, clearing. Those things and AgLayer as well, will blur the lines across different chains, and will give users a seamless experience as if they're interacting with one chain. But obviously, where the devil is in detail, and where there is like questions to be asked is, do users understand the trust assumptions? Because if it's been abstracted away, and then there's all these chains in the middle, and one of these chains aren't secure, then users might not understand the trust assumptions behind these chains, and could potentially get burnt.
I think it's pretty clear. Like the trust assumptions are not well understood, and users don't really care in the same way that they don't. Like it's too much of a hassle, right? If I want to trade NFTs, I'm not going to read like multiple pages about liveness assumptions and security guarantees that I'm just some random person, it's going to be an issue which I suspect will get resolved the hard way, which is basically people learn by getting hurt by observing and being affected by the collapses of certain unreliable pieces of infrastructure. And that's how we're going to consolidate, I suspect. Maybe form common standards, that would be nice, but maybe in 5 years.
LTBeat is doing God's work there as well.
They are.
It's what I see on this trade-off. I would say it's the first time in the history that we have this trade-off. But it's the first time actually that we have interoperability between chains in at least in a trustless way. I mean, without having, we have between layer ones, some bridges and so on. But if you remove this part, I mean, if you just having in a trustless way, just talking with another chain and then sending back. I mean, this is the first time that we are talking about that, because rollups are new and this is the first thing. And it's also somehow the first time that we are talking about this sovereignty, because a lot of applications, they were trying to build layer ones to build their own application. I mean, this is something that's not new, but I mean, how many projects just fail because they were just spending a lot of resources building a layer one when they were trying to build some very cool application. But building a layer one is hard. So for the first time, we have these layer twos. Layer twos is commoditizing. Right now, launching a rollup is quite straightforward. I mean, you just deploy a new. It's much easier to do that. So no sense to deploy a layer one for all applications. And we have for the first time also this possibility of interacting between the chains. So the question is, how hard we can push this trade-off. Of course, there is a trade-off, but I think that we are far away of the limits of this trade-off. This is where, I mean, in the AgLayer, this is where we are pushing. I mean, is how much, so what's the minimum sovereignty that you need to give away in order to be connected in a constellation of chains? What's the minimal thing? I mean, if you are connected to other chains, there is some rules that you need to follow. What are those minimum set of rules? We are packing that in what we call it a pessimistic proof, or if you want a proof that actually proves that this chain is not affecting the security of the other chains. But what's the minimal proof for the minimal thing to that, and what is the minimum friction for the interoperation between chains. And this is the work that we are currently doing, and this is the work, and we need to see where we are going to, so how much we can push on this trade-off. It's going to be a trade-off, but I think that at this point it's too early to actually talk about the trade-off, because I think that at this point we can have something that's almost, if it's not, maybe it's 99% sovereign, and the friction for composability between chains can be really, really low. It's going to be some friction. It's not going to be automatic, but it's going to be really, really low. And once we are there, then we can see, we can talk more about this trade-off and what it can be. But at this point, we need to push both things.
The other thing that might be useful to add, which is I think kind of implicit in some of the other answers, is that like there's this question of kind of the chain being sovereign, but I think the thing that we'll definitely see is sort of developers and people who launch chains being sovereign, and that means basically fundamentally each chain being able to make the decision of if there is a trade-off in the end, and maybe we end up with not enough trade-off to matter, but if there is a trade-off in the end, then when you launch a chain, you'll be able to actually decide where you are on that spectrum, and if 99% sovereignty is good enough, or if it's not, then you can have 100% sovereignty and not have kind of the same level of interoperability. And so it's kind of a really nice thing that the sort of, and this is all about modularity, the fact that the technology is not sort of baking in too many details as kind of fundamental decisions that developers are locked into.
But you can push very much. I mean, you can have a chain that actually is just do whatever you want in your chain. I mean, you decide what's the new state, and but what you need to guarantee if you are connected is that you are not going to spend some other's chain funds. That's the minimum thing you need to guarantee. But if you want to have a chain that actually is just deciding whatever they want, I mean, it's your problem, it's your home. You do whatever you want in your chain. That's I don't care. I mean, I would care if you are spending my funds or something like that. But if you are doing whatever you want in your chain, it's up to you. And this is the limit where we can go. Of course, serious chain is going to have some good state transfer function with maybe some proofs and some security warranties on there. But this is a decision of each chain. This is the sovereignty of the chain we are talking about. Each chain decides what they want to be. And then, but at the same time, you have this interoperability. I mean, you can connect to other chains in a safe, and this is where the rules, I mean, if you are connected there, here is where you need to set up the rules. And setting up these minimum rules so that you have a very low friction, so they can transfer in a fast way, in a low latency for the user, so relatively low friction, and with the safety mechanism, I think this is the big challenge that we have in the space right now.
I got a question for the audience. How many of you guys did some type of on-chain interaction today that wasn't a swap or transfer? Can you raise your hands higher? Okay, there's like 3 or 4. All right, so there's 3 or 4 users in the audience, and there's 3 or 4 roll-ups in the panel, so I think the answer is pretty apparent.
Using swaps and transfers. That's like the whole point of crypto, to transfer money.
Yeah, it's money and swaps. But, I mean, I do wonder what these users did.
Yeah, what'd you guys do? I mean, there's only 3 of you. It's okay, anonymity. Yeah, let's keep going. But I think the answer is self-explanatory there.
Mustafa, you guys have pioneered a concept of sovereign rollups, which I think kind of brings into a different light the way that these rollups are structured from a technical design. Maybe you could shed some insight onto that sovereignty versus interoperability question and kind of how you guys are looking at that sovereign rollup ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, like the word sovereign rollup is very loaded. But and there's like there's a lot of debates about like what does it even mean. But I'm not going to go into the meaning of sovereign rollups, but I think it's more about. I mean, the general idea. Okay, let's look at it from this perspective. Our thesis for Celestia, our rollup thesis for Celestia, is kind of inverted to Ethereum in the sense that for Ethereum, rollups exist to scale Ethereum, but Celestia exists to scale rollups, because we see rollups as more than just a scaling technology for Ethereum. Like, we don't just see, like, if you're deploying a rollup, I don't think, at least today, most of the people deploying rollups are deploying it because they want to scale Ethereum. Like, that's not why they're doing it. They're doing it because, as you asked at the start, why are people deploying application-specific rollups? And no one here said it's to scale Ethereum. They're deploying it because it's a superior way of developing applications than smart contracts for the reasons that we discussed here. So that's why our thesis is that basically that like, we believe in a world where rollups are going to replace smart contracts, and rollups are going to be the default way to deploy new decentralized applications. The same way that in Web 2, like, if you deploy a new application, no one uses a shared web hosting provider. Like, back in the old days, you used to upload your PHP code to some FTP server, and then it runs on the same server as, like, everyone else. No one does that anymore. Now people have their own virtual machines. They deploy a virtual machine in the cloud. And rollups are similar in that rollups are basically virtual blockchains that developers can deploy in minutes and use.
Yeah, I think that's largely going to shake out. Although, I mean, I feel at this point the word rollup gets heavily overloaded, because, yeah, the rollup technology stack will be definitely used in that way. But these are the application-specific rollups, and they need somewhere to settle. And for most use cases, I suspect L1s are going to become far too expensive to directly settle. We'll see how that shakes out. But I do feel like there is a layer of abstraction that's required, where the way I see it, how things are going to shake out is that layer 1s are going to be really the source of asset origination. They're going to be the digital gold, where it's the ultimate record of who owns the money. And layer 2s are going to be where application-specific rollups settle, and where perhaps you have kind of stores of identity records, or records of, like, value that aren't sufficiently valuable enough to pay what will become extremely high fees for layer 1s. My prediction, at least.
Yeah, I guess I generally don't love the term sovereign rollup. I don't have an issue with sovereign rollups as a construction. Like, the existence of and the idea behind sovereign rollups, like, I don't have a single thing to disagree with there in terms of the value proposition. I guess to me, like, interoperability and bridging and kind of like the settlement to sort of some other chain is just kind of a very fundamental property that's kind of like, it's the thing that all the rollups have been kind of, you know, optimistic and ZK and have been, you know, warring is too strong of a term, but like really kind of aggressively developing and fighting for, just because how sort of, at least I think from my perspective, how kind of like core, and there's various kind of, there's interesting debate over kind of social sovereignty versus technical sovereignty, and there's definitely kind of some nuance on this, but at least kind of from the perspective of kind of actually trying to create block space that is as similar as possible in the guarantees it can provide as Ethereum is a kind of a very different goal than trying to create kind of deeply sovereign and kind of relatively independent and easy to spin up application space.
Yeah, I mean, this is why I didn't want to like go into the definition of sovereign rollup here, but like why, like when I coined the term sovereign rollup, but many people who have been discussing it since haven't read my blog post carefully, and the sovereign rollups, there's no technical differentiator between sovereign rollups and non-sovereign rollups. I was very careful to say this in my blog post, but what I define sovereign rollups as having a social differentiator, not a technical differentiator. And that social differentiator is basically that that the community treats their, like, it basically says that the canonical fork choice rule or the canonical chain is defined by the community, not an L1 bridge contract. And that's not a technical differentiator at all. That's a very like minor social differentiator. And since then, like the OP people have argued that well, we are a sovereign rollup. Like we're gonna have multiple bridges. So it's like it's almost a meaningless definition. It's almost a meaningless differentiator. But it did start a interesting debate about is a rollup, what really is a rollup? Is the rollup the bridge or is the rollup the chain? And I think that's kind of like the more interesting part of it. But yeah.
No, totally agreed. And I think on top of both of those, also just generally the role that kind of social consensus plays. I mean, social consensus has been a topic of discussion for a very long time in the L1 domain. And I think the idea being that it's just as important in the L2 domain, essentially.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, here I fully agree. I think that the technical parts, of course, are going to be improvements, but we are in an open source space, and at some point it's going to be commoditized. Maybe in long, I mean, so still a long path to run here, but the technical part is going to be commoditized. So the differentiation are going to come more in the social, in the functionality, how you are building, the governance that we have, and yeah, this is where the space will have. Of course, it's going to be different technical backgrounds, some kind of technical alternatives and technical improvements, and of course all the technicals is not black or white. Maybe some technical improvements, maybe they imply some risk in adopting them, and then it's like, but again, we come again to the social part. I mean, the Rollup will adopt that. Yes, look, it's the sovereign part of the Rollup. So yeah, I fully agree that at least in the midterm, the important part is going to be the social sovereignty of the rollups. Technical is just going to be just one parameter on the decision making on each rollup.
And I think that's why we've seen the majority being centralized sequencers, kind of having that single or operator entity, which, you know, in worst case scenarios, we've seen things get rolled back, and you know, that kind of social consensus can happen rather than it taking weeks. Actually, Harry, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I am curious, is Arbitrum going to decentralize its sequencer? Is that on the roadmap? And yeah.
Oh, I'm happy to be put on the spot because I really wanted to jump in on that one. So, yeah, let's see. A couple different points I wanted to make. So, first of all, just to like start with like probably. I mean, I think there's an interesting trade-off in terms of fast block times versus sort of kind of varying degrees of decentralization, which will be an interesting kind of social choice. I mean, it is a great example of kind of where social consensus is important in terms of the development of technology. The reason why I would say it's valid for it to be a choice and it's not just like completely obvious is because from an Arbitrum design perspective, one of the really important principles from the beginning is like, hey, there's the sequencer, it's centralized, let's minimize its power as much as possible. So kind of, and I think there's a lot of misconceptions around kind of like what can the sequencer do. And so kind of, for example, in Arbitrum, if you're willing to wait a few minutes, then you can just wait for a sequencer to post its batch. And if you've waited for the sequencer to post its batch, the sequencer can't do anything to reorg. The sequencer doesn't control the state of the chain. It doesn't have any responsibility for kind of committing to the state of what executing the transactions will be. All it's doing is ordering and pushing data on chain. And so you can really evaluate these trade-offs of kind of like the pros and cons. And I think we think that and we've been kind of working with Espresso, and they've been doing some really great work on kind of very fast consensus that can enable sort of fast block times while achieving kind of a good degree of decentralization. But like it is a trade-off that chains can consider, and I don't think that like every chain, for example, will want to sort of give up, will want to slow down its block time enough to kind of decentralize.
Here also important to mention that, I mean, it's not a binary thing. It's centralized sequencer, decentralized sequencer. I mean, if you go to decentralized sequencer, how much decentralization you want there? And at the end, a decentralized sequencer means that you add a consensus layer there. And in the consensus layer, where in the trilemma you want to be? I mean, you want maybe something that's decentralized, a kind of a proof authority with maybe 2, 3, 4 nodes. This is more decentralized than just a centralized sequencer, as we understand, but it's much less decentralized than a full consensus chain on there. And deciding where you want to be, this is the part of the sovereign of the chain, and it's not something that's good or bad. I mean, for some chains, for some applications, I mean, it's not the same a DeFi chain that a gaming chain or or an insurance game or something that's a private chain. Depending what you want to build, the requirements of the sequencer are going to be different. And being able to decide that, I think, is important. You cannot force chains to decide, oh, you are going to have this. I mean, you need to give them the option in how much decentralization in the sequencer, but in many other parameters in the chain you want.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're kind of touching on the heart of something here, which is that there's a trade-off between decentralization and like the properties of a network that the user more directly experiences. So things like transaction throughput, finality times, latency. And the question is, I mean, what do users want? And I think the market's speaking quite overwhelmingly that they don't really want the layer 2s to be fully decentralized, which is, I find it rather amusing. So Aztec is going to be fully decentralized because I think we're probably the only layer 2 where the incentives actually align and we're incentivized to decentralize. I don't think Arbitrum's incentivized to decentralize. I don't think Polygon 0 is. Because why? You're going to make your user experience worse. And your users aren't really like technologically literate enough to even know what they're gaining from that. So I don't think anybody here is ever going to decentralize their chains to the level of anything approaching Ethereum, ever, apart from Aztec.
I mean, I would disagree with the idea that Arbitrum having a centralized sequencer makes it centralized. In that fundamentally, and kind of there's one really important feature that Arbitrum has is something that we call the force inclusion, which means that even if the sequencer is censoring you, it can delay your transaction. So it can certainly kind of ruin your UX, but the sequencer can't stop you from interacting with the chain entirely. And so you really kind of...
I'm just going to quote you back. Yeah. Arbitrum having a centralized sequencer doesn't make Arbitrum centralized. I mean, I'm not going to argue technical semantics with you. I mean, I appreciate that it's a trade-off space. Well, it's a trade-off space. I'm not saying that you're like JP Morgan and their Quora private blockchain. But that's a bit bloody rich.
Well, okay, so let me be more specific. There are two key properties that the chain has.
You are incentivized to decentralize properly, so you're not going to. Just admit it. Just admit it.
Well, let me just get this. There are two very important properties that the chain has. One of which is there's no centralized entity, and actually I'm going to ignore because there is kind of an element which is the Security Council with Arbitrum, which is I think something you could much more directly point at and question, as opposed to the sequencer, because there's two properties basically. One being the sequencer can't do anything to take money out of your pocket, and so you can have your money held on Arbitrum, and you're facing no risk if it's just kind of sitting there from the sequencer at all, because it can't contribute at all to sort of getting anything invalid committed. And the other is eventual censorship resistance. And it's not the strongest censorship resistance guarantee in terms of like, it would be nice if you could guarantee your transaction would be included extremely quickly, as opposed to only having a guarantee that after around a day your transaction would be included. But Ethereum itself doesn't even have any particularly strong censorship guarantees. And so it's not that there isn't a centralized element. There certainly is a centralized element. The point is that having the centralized element doesn't actually kind of hurt the main core security properties of the chain. The one thing, there are things it does do that are negative. So for example, the sequencer on Arbitrum right now does not do any crazy MEV extraction that kind of hurts user experience, and like right now it's trusted to be first come first serve, and if the sequencer was malicious it could certainly hurt the UX of using Arbitrum a lot, no question. And like one of the real like incentives to decentralize and reasons why kind of we're pushing and trying to achieve this is because users want that type of guarantee and we don't want to trust a centralized entity. But I want to differentiate, and because I think it's really important to differentiate what the sequencer can do and what it can't do, because there's a lot of things that it can't do.
I mean, God, that was a lot of words. To try to defend your centralized sequencer.
You got about 1 minute.
Rug the shit out of your users by fiddling around with MEV, and it can censor users and force them to send very expensive forced inclusion transactions. Listen, I'm not disagreeing fundamentally with you here, like on the technical details. I'm just pointing out the outcome, which you don't want to acknowledge, which is you just do not have a proper incentive to get rid of that centralized sequencer, because most users, I think, probably do trust Arbitrum to not rug them with meth. Most users probably do trust Arbitrum to not censor their transactions. And so, I mean, if I were in your shoes, I wouldn't. I would write a lot of blog posts and say a lot of words about how we're like mostly decentralized and to justify not doing anything, because decentralizing is a pain in the ass and it worsens user experience. So what I'm saying is that you don't have the incentives to decentralize fully. The YAT sequencer you have, it's never decentralizing. I bet money on it.
Well, I mean, okay, that's...
Wait, one, and then yeah. So we are very actively working and collaborating on kind of the technical work to build out and kind of relying heavily and working with Espresso to build out a decentralized sequencing system that is deeply compatible with Arbitrum chains. Whether that is adopted will be a question of social consensus, and we had some great conversation. And I won't tell you there's a DAO. The control of the chain is owned by the DAO. They might not adopt it, as you say. It might be, but essentially it is a matter of social consensus whether it's adopted or not.
So can I just rephrase what you said? I respect Espresso Systems. Bloody great team. But I just want to point out what you're saying is decentralization is so important to us, we've contracted it out to a third-party company. I mean, come on.
Well, we believe in a thing called modularity.
It's modular.
Modular blockchain, yeah. No, it means making the things you don't care about somebody else's problem.
I guess to synthesize this debate, I mean, I think there's good points on both sides, but I think ultimately it comes down to like what are the properties we're trying to achieve. Because I don't think decentralization isn't the end goal. The end goal is to use decentralization to achieve something. So things like censorship resistance and trust minimization. And I guess you're arguing is that the values that doesn't achieve is that it leaks too much MEV. Things like it's leaking MEV. You have to trust the sequence of the MEV and so on and so forth, right? And then their argument is that, well, the values we're trying to have is censorship resistance, and we can achieve that.
I'm not saying they should decentralize. I'm just really pointing out that they're not going to decentralize.
Again, I mean,
That's all.
Zach, I mean, this decentralization is not a black or white. I mean, you have different properties, and you can achieve different degree of these properties. It's not this, because you don't have this property, you are not.
I literally said that like 5 minutes ago. I said it's a spectrum.
I essentially, I agree with you. I mean, I think that we are very far away of the decentralization that we should be. But let me just ask a question, maybe not to you, but the users that are, maybe ask a question to the users that are using those chains.
The three of them in the audience.
Do you want to have a finality of 1 second, or you want to have this decentralization, but this penalty is going to be maybe that you will have to wait for the users 15 seconds? What the user will tell. I mean, what's the demand?
It's a rhetorical question, right? Because like I proposed the same question like 10 minutes ago, and I'm like, yeah, users don't care. Like they're not good. That's the problem. Well, it's not like the justification. It's the problem. Look, users aren't willing. Like they're not going to care about decentralization.
Zach, I mean, I'm quite disappointed in the space, especially for that. But the reality is that there is a market there, and the demand, so the trade-off that the market is asking for the degree of decentralization. I mean, the market is not asking for centralized systems because they would go maybe to some SQL databases. Okay, so they're asking for some security, some guarantees, some trustless guarantees somehow. But at the same time, they are asking also for high finality, good. I mean, things that are quite difficult to achieve in a decentralized way. So, and this is the market, and this is the cool thing also again of having different chains, because when you have different rollups, you can achieve different degrees of decentralization, and at the end, it's going to be market for each one. But essentially, I mean, if you ask me, of course, essentially, I already told you, I'm quite disappointed that the people is asking for this low degree of decentralization. I would like people to have to ask for more decentralization, but the reality of the market is what it is.
Yeah, thank you, Jordi and Zach. And Harry, that question opened a Pandora's box, and it was like great. Partially the goal, but that went further. But can we have a great round of applause for our lovely panelists? And thank you, guys.